Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the Stand and Talk podcast from the TJS Stand. I am your director and founder Shmuel von Weisel, and I'm so delighted to welcome a really unique voice all the way from Israel, Menachem. Welcome to the TJS Stand. Menachem Isserof was born in Brooklyn to a Chabad family. He moved to Israel in 2013. He drafted to the IDF and served for 3 years in the paratroopers in the 101st Battalion, first as a combat medic, then as a commander, also a gun team commander, and finally as a drill sergeant. And since the 7th of October, Menachem served in the front lines on and off in Gaza and also in Lebanon. In addition, Menachem directs the Lone Soldier Empowerment Foundation, which is an Israeli non-profit that supports pre- and post-draft lone soldiers, whose mission it is to empower lone soldiers to stay in Israel after their release. And Menachem and his family live in Rehovot, and after completing his degree in biomedical science, his master's in biochemistry and protein design, he's now starting his PhD at the Weizmann Institute in cellular biology, with a focus on aging research. Wow, after that very important introduction, Menachem, how are you and how is your family?
Yeah. Oh, I'm great. We're doing great. Actually, so recently the Weizmann Institute was hit by a missile. I'm sure people are aware, have heard of it. Maybe they haven't heard of it, but that was my lab was in the building that was struck, and so spent a lot of time at home, working from home, and just recently we got back into the lab and we started working. So it's been really, really nice to just be back in the lab and doing work that'll hopefully be helping people, live longer, healthier lives. So that's good.
I hope it wasn't anything personal. We should mention it was the Iranians this time who destroyed your lab.
Yeah.
Was there anything you did specifically?
So it's a good question because actually it's not so clear why they would strike a cancer research lab. But I genuinely think because if you go on Google and you look up the lab itself, it's marked as the Faculty of Chemistry for some reason on Google. And I genuinely think they just kind of like looked up because they also struck a building that was in construction for the Faculty of Chemistry. So I think somebody just went on Google in Iran, looked it up, was like, all right, send it. And
They had something specifically against chemistry. Maybe they had a bad teacher. You never know.
Yeah.
All right. So Menachem, we don't hear many voices from the IDF in the UK, especially, and I think it's such an opportunity to have you on here, and it's so great. So I guess first question. Like I said in the introduction, you have a family, you're studying for your PhD, and yet in the background of all this, you also served in the front lines in Gaza. So first off, as we started, what was your experience juggling war and normal life? And I guess also as a follow-up was it even sustainable?
Yeah. So it's complex. It's not easy by any means. You have a lot going on, and I'll say it's not just me juggling; it's my family juggling, and behind nobody really knows how true this is until you have to serve in reserves. But behind every great man is a great woman, and I'm not a great man, but my wife is a very great woman, and she held our family together while I was in reserves, and behind her was her whole family, and so essentially. I have to thank my wife for being able to do what I'm doing, but it's incredibly complex, and you have to have a really solid, strong relationship and like with your family and with your partner, if you have a partner. And we have a son at home, and who was 2.5 at the time, and so that was incredibly complicated. Luckily for me, he knew that I went to reserves because a month prior I had done a week of medic training, so he was kind of like tuned into the concept that I could be in reserves at any moment. And for him, it was just like on October 7th at around 7 a.m., 8 a.m., after 2 hours of rocket fire, I was like, okay, we're probably going to be called up. And so I pulled down my bag full of equipment. And, so when my son saw me do that, he's like, oh, daddy's going to the army. Like it wasn't a big shock for him. But I think for a lot of people who weren't as regular in the reserves, that it was a huge shock for them. Like it was a very, very big challenge for their kids. And I know people whose kids stopped talking to them for the period of time while they were in the army, right? They couldn't handle the back and forth, and they couldn't handle them being gone for so long, and the unknowns involved in being a combat soldier in reserves. And I'll say, I think a lot of like times we kind of see Israel and Israelis as everybody serves in the army and everybody serves in the IDF. But in reality, in a combat role, I think it's less than 3% of the entire population that serves in combat in Israel. And like, as it should be, right? You need a country to function. But it also means that it's a very lonely world when you get back, right? Like, you get back, and I'm in academia, so even less people are serving in combat roles in academia and the Weizmann Institute, right? And it doesn't mean that people didn't serve in different roles in the IDF. Intelligence, logistics, identifying bodies. So a lot of people took their degrees and went to help with the identification of bodies or other biological services that needed to happen after October 7th. And those people sacrificed a lot to be there. But as a combat soldier, it was a very lonely world, like getting back. I even had, somebody once told me, guns aren't really, there's no place for guns in academia. And, I couldn't help but wonder, like, okay, if we didn't have guns, then what academia would there be even? Unfortunately. So for me, it was a very big challenge. And even the emotional struggle of, let's say I was doing my master's when I was called up on October 7th. I got back 6 months later, and then I did, 2 or 3 months of work, and I got called up again and went to defend Metula, which was under attack by Hezbollah, like actively rocket fire, drones, missiles. While we were there, we probably, throughout the day, we would spend most of our day in a bomb shelter or setting up fortifications and defenses for this imagined eventuality. I say imagined, right? But you could not imagine in the sense that it wasn't going to happen, but imagine in the sense that you have to be very creative as a soldier and imagine what the possibilities are, right, of your enemy. If they're going to come from this road, we got to set up this fortification here. And so most of our time was either spent setting up fortifications or staying in a bomb shelter with like no internet or phone service. And so you can't really work, right? Obviously, like I say this, but but the hope is that you can work. And then so you get back, and then you do some more work in your lab. And then all this is recorded, right? Because I'm an academic, so I have to write everything down in a notebook, right? So you see these big chunks of time where, okay, you did work for 4 months, and then you're nothing for 2 months, and then another 3 months of intense work, and then nothing for another 2 months. And emotionally, that's very difficult because you constantly imagine what if I could have had more time. These projects are very personal. As in academia, you get a project and it's your baby. And it's going to succeed or fail on the effort that you put in. And sometimes in this situation, the effort wasn't enough. Like you just could not put in enough time with the way that it was set up. And so that was a huge struggle. Like just writing a master's thesis and having to go through essentially the experience of October 7th and the deployments and everything, just because you see the dates was very hard as something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can't really, think about here in the UK how difficult it will be. I mean, I just finished my 3-year degree, my undergraduate, and, a lot of, extra consideration that students can apply for is, they're a bit ill, or if they're a bit maybe mentally they needed to take some time off, or maybe even, there was a family incident. And that's like the worst thing you can imagine for a student, right? And yet in Israel, for your reality, it was, I'm going to have to take some time off to go protect my family, to fight in a war. Was that even possible? Did academia accommodate that?
Yeah, so I'll say the Weizmann Institute has to get a lot of credit for this, that they were amazing, like beyond words. I don't think every academic institution was like this, but the Weizmann Institute was fully behind their reservists and provided them with their full benefits that they could provide, mental health services for when they got back, more time, as much time as you needed, which is a blessing and a curse. When you don't have a framework and everybody's just like, take your time, then sometimes you take your time and not in a good way. So some people even fall into a trap with that. And it's especially true, I'm going off on a tangent here, but when you get back from reserves and you have to do this switch from a very regimented, focused lifestyle in the army, you know what time you're waking up, you know what time you're going to sleep, you know what your mission is the next day, you know what your mission, you know what you're doing. Like your life is simple, eat, sleep, fight. That's it, like protect your family. It's a huge level of mashmaut, and like it's a hugely meaningful mission. Sorry, slipped into Hebrew for a second. And then you get back to what people call real life, which I hate the term. I think it's all the same, right? But people kind of make this barrier between these worlds. And they say, okay, when I'm in the army, I'm like this. When I'm in civilian life, I'm like this. And then they don't know what to do with themselves. Like I've experienced it myself, right? You get back and you're like, wow, just the overwhelming sense of like, I have to start all of this over. I have to get into it. I have to, explain to everybody where I've been the last 3 months. And they're going to ask questions. They're going to ask if I'm okay. And sometimes it's better to just, instead of having this open-ended thing, just go into it and just, here you are, like nothing ever happened. Nobody asks any questions. You just start working. So my second deployment was like that. It was very nice because I went straight from Lebanon, really fighting in Lebanon, to agent conference, and I just spent 2 days doing science, hearing talks and talking to people. And that was like healing for the soul, you get out of a combat zone where people were killed in our company, in our pluga. And you just, for a second, you're like, okay, I'm back. I can just get into things. Versus like in my first deployment after 4 months, so that was a bit more intense, October 7th, we got called up to Kfar Aza. We fought in Kfar Aza. We got called up to Gaza, and we fought in Gaza for 2 months. It was supposed to be a 14-day deployment, turned into a 2-month deployment. And you get home and you haven't been by yourself. Forget the war. Like, just as a human being, just spending time alone with no other humans around, 3 months, you're just with somebody constantly. And I told my wife, like, I'm going to be a father, I'm going to be a husband, don't talk to me. Otherwise, like 2 weeks, I'm not doing anything. I sat on the couch for 2 weeks, didn't even feel bad about it, just took that time for a second. And I was like, nobody talks to me. I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing any work. And that's it.
That's a lot of credit to your wife who let you have those 2 weeks.
Yeah, look, I wasn't like
for her.
absent. No, I wasn't absent. Right? I was a father and I was a husband. But other than that, I didn't go to work. I didn't focus on the nonprofit side of things. That I the nonprofit I direct. I didn't talk to anybody there. Like, from my perspective, I just needed to just not be with anybody for 2 weeks. And I also had this weird thing where like some sort of post-trauma from it, where I didn't want to hang out with anybody from my platoon. I love them, right? Like, they're my brothers, but I didn't want to see them. Like, I didn't want to talk to them. I didn't want to go to barbecues. I just for 3 months, I just didn't want to have anything to do with them. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever.
That specifically, then, I mean, quick disclaimer, people who watch the podcast already know, I already mentioned it before, but I also was in IDF. I was in the 202nd, so where Menachem was in the 101st, we were in 202nd. And I remember also when I released, when I finished, it takes a long time to leave the army. It's not just, okay, people, I guess it's not talked about enough, how the impact of leaving the army itself is a traumatic thing, just leaving it, finishing your service. So, you can't even imagine what it's like to leave the army from a war, which is just as traumatic, and then try to go back to civilian life. And then all of a sudden, this isn't the end, you're going back again. And you're going to have to leave, and every single time it's to do that switch. I mean, I'm sure, people like to say it's probably easier to do the jump from civilian into the army because it's just, you don't have time to think. But then you get home and you do have that time to think, and you do have that time to reflect. And it's a lot harder to resettle, and we don't really appreciate it enough, when we say about the IDF soldiers or fighting in Gaza. And I think this is really good then to move us on to our next question. As we mentioned, you served in Gaza and in Lebanon since the 7th of October. I have to ask this question because in the UK, I'm sure also around the world, young Jews are being bombarded with fake news about how evil the IDF is. We know that the propaganda war since the 7th of October has spread across the world, and often obviously in favor of anti-Zionist perspectives, and the IDF is at the forefront of that, accusations and hatred, really. We saw recently in the UK our own festival where death to the IDF was shouted. So, the IDF is at the forefront also in that anti-Zionist perspective. So I guess this is really an excellent opportunity, since seeing as you were there in person in Gaza and in Lebanon, What was your experience fighting Hamas in Gaza and also Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Man, it's such a wide question. Um, that like I think as you've asked the question, there's like 15 different answers that popped into my head for different aspects of this. If we can just focus, I guess, in the beginning on is the IDF a moral army, and say it emphatically and clearly that insofar as state-sponsored violence can be a moral thing, and if you think that that's a moral thing, then the IDF is the most moral army in the world, in that it is not an expeditionary force. It's not there to go contrary to very popular opinions. The IDF is not an occupying force. It's not interested in taking over lands. That was never the goal, right? Like, listen to what the name of the IDF is. It's the Israeli Defense Force, right? It's not the Israeli like military force or the Israeli Expeditionary Forces. By the way, I think the United Kingdom has an expedition, like a specifically named, right, expeditionary force.
The BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So, so it's not that. And the primary and probably only goal of the IDF is to defend the state of Israel from threats, from external and internal threats, and external threats. I mean, so the IDF is a moral army. More than like past that point, right? And okay, don't take my word for it. Like because I'm in the IDF, so you don't have to take my word for it because maybe I can't see past my own nose, and I think I'm the good guy. I think everybody tends to think they're the good guy, right? But just on a fundamental level, anybody who doesn't think the IDF is a moral army, if you just pull out a random dude from any of the armies that the IDF has fought in the last 70 years and pull out a random guy from the IDF and put them side by side and just talk to them as human beings and understand what their moral system is, what their value system is, whether they represent what you represent, whether they think the way you think, and whether you would want to live with them in your country or like have them control some aspect of your life. And I have no question in my mind that 100 times out of 100, you would pick the guy from the IDF over literally any other army. And we'll put aside the label of terrorist or freedom fighter or whatever, right? But just on a logical level, as an individual who wants to live in a democracy, right, and who wants to have peace and prosperity and have freedom of religion, these are all values that almost every single soldier in the IDF, no organization is a monolith, but almost every single individual in the IDF holds and would fight, by the way, to defend your right to have, and does fight actively to defend your right to have. So it's not a cliche when we say the IDF is a moral army. It genuinely is. Does that mean every individual in the IDF is a perfect paragon of humanity? No, obviously not, right? Like, it's a cross-section of Israeli society. So there are going to be people who I personally think are reprehensible human beings, like on a personal level. But it doesn't mean also that they're out there to kill Arabs and take over lands and right. But their moral judgments are my moral judgments, right? And that's why we have laws, and that's why we have orders, and that's why the IDF is not a militia but an organized army with a enforcement system in place for when people do break the rules. And on a personal level, there's a very strong, I can't speak for other units, but in our unit, and I'm sure you can speak for your own unit, there's a very strong moral character to the unit. It's you view yourself as moral, and you view yourself as Western, and you view yourself as morally Jewish also, in the perspective of Jewish morality. And so that automatically limits to what you're going to do to the enemy and what you're going to do to enemy combatants and civilians. So the IDF is a moral army. Let's start with that. I think that's important to state.
and then moving on to your experiences in Gaza itself, how does that conflate with fighting? Yeah.
So my subjective experience on this, overwhelmingly, everybody who's there doesn't want to be there. Not in the sense that they don't want to defend the Jewish homeland. They're not interested in conquering lands and pillaging and destroying and killing. They're not there for that. They wouldn't be here if their hand wasn't forced. That being said, I think it's really important to state my perspective on this is that the Israel as a country should have a policy of no greater friend and no worse enemy. And if you started something, then you better be sure that you can finish it, or we're going to finish you. Like I think that should be the perspective. You know, I don't think we need to wait to die a death by 1,000 cuts, and I don't think that this morality of proportionality makes sense. I don't think anybody who brings it up also has never lived under the constant threat of missile attacks, never experienced 1,000 of their countrymen being murdered and raped, never had to go clear a house where they found the body of an old lady shot in her safe room or in her bathroom hiding. So I don't think we need to give our enemies the opportunity, and I don't think also that it's a numbers game. You know, just because 1,000 people died here and 5,000 people died here, it doesn't equate to morality, and it doesn't equate to who's right or wrong. And like also, I think we don't acknowledge this enough. It's okay that we have enemies. I think it's okay that some people view us as the bad guys. We don't have to make everybody our friends. It's fine. They don't like you either. They would never like you. There are some parts of the world, probably over a billion people in the world, probably, who would just never like Jews. They're just not. There's no argument or conversation you can have with them that's going to convince them otherwise. It's a part of their moral fabric, and it's okay to say, "Hey, I don't care. Can I curse here?" Like, but you know, like those people aren't important. Like they shouldn't matter to you. And like and I'm sorry, I'm saying this as a Jew and as an Israeli, their deaths should not matter to me because I didn't choose their deaths. Like they chose that for themselves. They chose that fight. And I can say with 100% certainty that not a single person who's in reserves in the IDF in Gaza would choose that life for themselves. Not a single one. Okay? Even the most gung-ho of Israel Shlema, Eretz Israel Shlema, this conspiracy theory that we want to take over all of the Levant and make it. Even people who genuinely believe that, which is a minority of a minority in Israel, wouldn't choose the life of war for them and their families. They want it on an abstract level, maybe, but at their core, at their moral core, they're not interested in it. And so what I experienced on a personal level in Gaza and in Lebanon were people who were there to defend their families and defend their homes, and who were with feet in both worlds at the same time, who came to do a mission and nothing more than that. And that mission was to remove the threat of Hamas or Hezbollah, wherever it was relevant, from the civilians of the state of Israel. Completely remove, or as much as possible within the framework of our mission. So our mission in the south, in Gaza, was to open up a corridor for further attacks inside of Khan Yunis. And in Lebanon, it was to help clear southern Lebanon from the threat of Hezbollah. And in both cases, one, there were no civilians, zero civilians, okay? Not like, oh, here and there, zero civilians, because we had told them what our plans were a month in advance. And so you come to a house, there's no food in the fridge, all the clothing is folded up nicely and put away, okay, like stored for long-term storage, all right? They're like valuables and belongings. You couldn't steal if you wanted to. There's nothing to steal, right? Like, and you weren't allowed to, one, and nobody wanted to, two. But even if you did want to and you were allowed to, there was nothing to steal, right? Because they took all their valuables with them. No cars, right? There's nothing there. And so essentially, everybody you find there is Hamas. Not essentially. Everybody you found there was Hamas, was holding a gun. On our first day there, we were ambushed by 3 separate times in different locations by people not wearing uniforms, right? Who were holding weapons and firing at us. Right? And so you can understand also the value, even in a situation where there were no civilians and not wearing a uniform offered no protection and offered no benefits. Hamas was happy to not wear a uniform and fight you not wearing a uniform because they saw the value in somebody perceiving them as civilians who were killed. If you found that body, a year later, and you saw it was just a civilian, a guy who died wearing civilian clothes, right? And we took away their weapon because we're not going to leave the weapons lying around. Then, that's another civilian that was killed by the IDF. I'm going to stop for a second just to give you a second if you want to focus the question.
No, I think that's really interesting what you're saying, because we do see it from, there seems to be this thing that every time, obviously we talk about the BBC, but it's not just the BBC. It's most, even the pro-Israel organizations that we like to sometimes quote, they have a tendency to still, when Hamas or they say the Hamas run health ministry, they quote figures or they quote claims, it's instantly taken as fact. And when IDF, it seems to be this, let's not agree, let's not believe anything that IDF says. And again, it's also that aspect compared with the aspect of portraying the IDF as these gung-ho people looking to kill everyone they see and looking to ethnically
we don't do
cleanse.
Like, because then you got like, one in, we called up, how many reserves did we call up? 300,000 reservists. Okay. So 500 of them make TikToks. Okay. And those are the TikToks that end up on social media, like on global news networks around the world. So we don't do ourselves any favors, I think, in that respect. And also the BBC, I love that you mentioned the BBC, the Hamas run health ministry. At this point, they put it as a footnote just to say to impartial, it's a claim impartiality, but really, like, it's almost like like they're as if they're actually quoting a legitimate source, or like, hey, we said it was from the health ministry, so the reader can understand that we're not getting 100% behind this statement. But like, also the whole article is just like complete anti-Israel garbage, but like at the bottom.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like you say, some people just don't like Jews. Now, I'm not going to claim that the BBC is anti-Semitic. I'm not going to do that on this podcast. I'm not opening up for any problems. But it is an idea that if you're starting from a standpoint where you don't want to believe the IDF and you don't want to believe anything that Israel is saying in defense of their own actions, then obviously you're going to believe anything anyone else says. And it's also you hear this a lot from other soldiers. Maybe you felt the same. It's like when a lot of soldiers went into Gaza, they were shocked by the level of how Hamas and hatred of Jews was embedded in Gaza, something that no one talks about also.
So yeah, really important that you said that. And I fundamentally, Gaza and Lebanon, people bring this up, right? How was the IDF able to so quickly clear Lebanon of Hezbollah? But look at this massive failure on October 7th. Piers Morgan recently came on some I think, the Trigonometry podcast and talked about this. Shout out, by the way. Right? And how is it that the IDF can't figure out, that... And so I was there, Piers. Hi.
If you're watching this, Piers.
Yeah, Piers Morgan is definitely going to watch this. I can say that you walk into a house in Gaza, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that 90% of the houses had either material or ideological support of Hamas. 90%. And what do I mean by material support of Hamas? I mean a weapon, vest, an entrance to an underground tunnel network, either in or outside of their house. And I can say also that the 10% of houses that didn't show any ideological support of Hamas. So how do I know that they had ideological support of Hamas? You're in their house, right? So you fight house to house. Unfortunately, Hamas made it that way, right? Because they decided that this was the defensive strategy that they were going to pick. They were going to fight out of people's houses, not set up defensive structures. So we were fighting outside of people's houses. And when you're in their house, you have to check for weapons. You have to check for enemies. So you go through their house. You see what's going on in their house. So in houses that didn't have any material or ideological, in houses that didn't have any ideological support of Hamas, there's also no material support. So there was no tunnel network. There was no tunnels. There was no weapons, right? So that indicated to me, like, and maybe you can understand this differently, that you had the right to say no, could say no, and did say no. We spent 2 months, in a house of a family, a very well-to-do family, that had no ideological support for Hamas. They were Fatah people, so I don't know if your listeners understand the difference between these organizations, but I'll leave it to you. One's Islamic and one's secular, but I think there's not really a secular representation.
In short, Fatah are the ones who control the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas control the Gaza Strip. And obviously it's a civil war between them. Well, not anymore, yeah, but they did.
Yeah, they're not on friendly terms, and Gaza was finally taken over by Hamas from the Palestinian Authority, which is Fatah. And so this guy and his family were Fatah people. And we were in their house for 2 months and we didn't find any indication, no weapons, no tunnels, nothing. But the house over, right, one house over, or like right outside of their property line, there's a tunnel, and across the street, there's a whole Hamas compound, like a family of a commander, a regional commander of Hamas, and his house, his neighbor's house, the buildings, everything around them was full of weapons, ammunition, tunnels. And so that told me that people had a choice, and a lot of people picked Hamas, and I don't blame them because you spend a decade and a half being educated a certain way, and 50% of Gaza is under the age of 18, or is under the age of 18, not was, is under the age of 18, and so that means functionally that every 50% of Gaza was raised by Hamas, right? And so it's not surprising to me that when you walk into a house in Gaza, that most of the houses in Gaza, unless they were Christian or unless they were Fatah, supported Hamas materially, right? And so when you look at these houses, these whole neighborhoods that are leveled, and you're like, wow, the IDF is committing, what is it? URBA, right? Genocide. They made up all these genocide terms for what the IDF is doing. They couldn't prove that the IDF was doing genocide. Let's make up other terms, right? Ecocide. Right? Because you look at the destruction and you say, wow, how do I justify this? Like, how do I make sense of this in my head? And if you're not there and you don't see it, you can't imagine that you living in your home would have a tunnel network under your house that you would agree to and put into your house. But the people of Gaza have been so brainwashed by Hamas. And we know this also because I look, unfortunately, and this is a sad reality for me that I can say this, I looked at people's family photos, and you can see their photos, right? From the 90s, the 80s, 90s, and you see people, no head coverings, dressed like, not Western, but like kind of like Israelis were dressed, around that time period. And then you look at them today, and you look at the family pictures today, and you can see the radicalization happen, right, in a family where 90% of the people aren't wearing anything, they're not religious, and then a decade or two later, or you go to today, everybody's religious, everybody is radicalized, and we let that happen. I can't say we didn't let that happen. I think like a little bit of the blame lies by our feet, but that also is the reason. We'll get into that in a second, maybe. But that is also the reason why most of Gaza is rubble today, because Hamas chose a deliberate strategy that forced the IDF to level every single house in a neighborhood in order to ensure that no harm could come to soldiers or civilians from that infrastructure. And then when you go to Lebanon, by the way, that's not the case. Hezbollah, you didn't have to do this. Okay, you can also say the topography is different, the geology is different. They can't dig the tunnels like they do in Gaza. So maybe they're not so nice, but they didn't choose this deliberate strategy, right? Regardless of what the case is, like, you don't have to level every house in Lebanon, because the houses that are civilian houses are civilian houses, and there's no weapons there. And if even in the houses that showed ideological support for Hezbollah, they didn't have massive infrastructure under their house or in their house to materially support the fighters. Like, okay, so they supported you walk in and there's a big picture of Nasrallah in the foyer as they walk in, and you can maybe find a shotgun or an AK or something, right? They were clearly people who were a little more active, but you had to go to a house or two over to find the weapons store. It wasn't in their house. Hezbollah didn't choose to use these civilians as human shields in their defensive strategy. It did. By the way, it didn't mean that Hezbollah didn't choose to not wear uniforms while fighting Israel, but they didn't employ the strategy in the same way that Hamas did.
And you definitely see that also with the government of Lebanon. I mean, I don't know where things are going to go, and we never know in the Middle East nowadays. Things are happening so fast, but it seems like the government does seem to want to maybe take a bit more control over Hezbollah. Whether that's going to happen, what direction they're going to be, it seems like there is a form of separation of Hezbollah and government, at least now, especially after the Beeper operation, which didn't exist in Gaza. Hamas was the governing body, and they were, the absolute end all, like you said. I think it's really important to hear these perspectives from the ground, because, like we said, you hear everything from that happens there. It's very much one-sided. It's very much a portrait of this evil Jew wanting to ethnically cleanse Muslims, right? That's always the way they try to build it, which obviously is not true when you know that Israel is such a wonderful democracy and open for all religions. And of course, there's Muslims who fight in the IDF, and I'm sure we can probably know a couple, right? And yet the perspectives have shown, and obviously the whitewashing, the total whitewashing of the absolute complexity that you mentioned of what goes on in Gaza. I think there's something that, and maybe I want to move on to, if that's okay with you.
Can I just one point, because I think it's super important. I think we fall into this trap of not acknowledging the human suffering. I think it's like also hard to, like, I want to acknowledge for a second that there is legitimate human suffering in Gaza that I can't diminish, and that I wouldn't want my worst enemy to live in those conditions. Where we differ, I think where me and a lot of people maybe differ, is one, my perspective, and two, who we lay the blame for this decision at, right? Like at whose feet do we lay the blame of this decision? And I think what responsibility do I have as an individual to take care of somebody who I know wants to kill me, right? And I think Israel has done more than most anybody would do for. It's not a population that's neutral. They actively don't like you, and they would be happy if you died, and so you're feeding them, but because they're non-combatants and because it's morally the right thing to do. And ultimately, I think it's really important for anybody listening that we acknowledge that there is real human suffering happening in Gaza, and that we have these numbers games doesn't diminish, the human suffering that exists. But ultimately, that human suffering needs to be laid at the feet of the people who are actively making the decision every day to continue that human suffering, right? So I think Hamas is the one to blame for this, and we are, in some senses, their emissaries for the human suffering that they've chosen for the people of Gaza. So we bring on that human suffering, and like, if I can be honest, I feel bad for the people of Gaza, but I will make that decision 100% of the time if it means getting my people home. And I don't feel responsible for the people of Gaza. I'm not their government, and they want me dead, full on, right? So it doesn't mean that I want them to suffer, but I also don't feel that I'm responsible for their suffering. And at any point, Hamas could decide, hey, we don't want our people to suffer anymore. And I think it would make things much harder for anybody to continue a war in Gaza, right? But they choose not to do that every day.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really important point, is to also acknowledge that there is human suffering, and that's something I think would be very hard pressed to find people who rejoice at that or celebrate that. I think that's something that doesn't exist, at least in the ethos of the IDF and on the regular person, like you said. But I think this is also a really good segue into our next question, which we dealt with. We talked about the big propaganda war sort of that's been fighting against Israel that we feel across the world. But there's also within our Jewish communities, there's a lot of arguments about this. And like if you saw the last podcast with Phil Rosenberg, there are many Jews around the world who claim that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own political survival. That's such a provocative statement. But Menachem, how does that political aspect of the conflict affect you? Keeping in mind the hostages and keeping in mind that they're talking about a ceasefire all the time, but it does have an effect, and that's what we discuss. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'll say this because I went on record at the beginning of the war. I was interviewed by the Washington Post, and it was supposed to be an interview about reservists in who are coming from America and who have family in America and the challenges there. And I told them about my sister. My sister is very anti the war, like very, very anti-war in general. So it also became an article about how families disagree, and we're on record there. I'm on record there saying that I can only hope that our leadership knows what they're doing and has a plan. I said this, in October of 2023, and I'll say that as a citizen of the state of Israel, not as an IDF soldier, I have a very hard time with the fact that the plan is not communicated effectively. I don't think there's no plan, but I think the plan is not effectively communicated, not to the citizens of the state of Israel, certainly not to the Jewish communities in the diaspora, even though, funnily enough, Benjamin Netanyahu has gone on record more often in foreign media than he has in Israel, right? So he doesn't do interviews in Israel, but he'll happily go on Fox News or some podcast and talk about, all of these things with foreign audiences, but not with his own people. And I think that leads to a lot of frustration inside of Israel, where people, two Jews, three opinions, right? So it's a country full of Jews. So everybody's got their opinions. And if you can't base your opinions on any objective reality, and, you're a part of, each citizen is a part of the government. Like, each citizen contributes to the society and to their country. And Israel's not a big country. And so when you feel like you're on a ship and, that you're 2 degrees separated from Benjamin Netanyahu, probably, every Jew is like 2 degrees of separation from another Jew. And so, in Israel, every Israeli, forget Jew, every Israeli is like, somebody's cousin who's in the army with this guy, and it doesn't matter if they're from an Arab town up north, or if they're a Druze person, or if they're Bedouin, like, you find some connection to literally everybody. So it's very hard to continue doing what you're doing and not know what's the plan, dude. Like, what are we doing here, And I think that's understandable, because I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice of being too forthcoming with our perspectives and opinions to people who don't deserve our honest perspective and opinions, because they're not being honest they're not being honest with us about their perspectives. And even if they are being honest, they might hate you. Like, it could be their honest perspective is, I want you to die. And then what you're trying to do is, hey, we want peace and we want to hang out. We just want to live here. And you're communicating with this person who just approached the conversation not in good faith. And we do this a lot. And I think there's something to be said about having these conversations internally and figuring them out, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? Because we're Western and we believe in freedom of speech, and we believe in open conversation and dialogue, and we assume that people are coming to us with an honest and good faith argument and perspective, and that's just simply not the case. For most of the world, for most of the world, but for most of the Middle East, it's not the case. And the individuals who come from the Middle East and, I won't say infiltrate, but become a part of the democracy that they join, whether it's in the UK, Australia, the United States, they don't hold the same perspective as you about what truth is and how truth is said. And that's okay, right? But it affects how you need to communicate with them about your perspective. And what we try and do, right? It's crazy. For 100 years, forever long Israel has been around, the term that we use for Israel advocacy is what?
Hasbara.
If I just explain my perspective, right? I don't need to. Of course I'm right. I just need to explain it to you so that you understand, right? That's it. That's the only part. The only issue here is that you just don't understand that I'm right. And I just need to explain it to you. And if I can explain it to you well enough, you'll get it and you'll agree with me. No, of course not. Like, we're so bad at this, Al Jazeera doesn't explain anything. They do narratives. They'll put some guy who's living in Hebron, whose brother probably killed a IDF officer, who has to walk through, and look at this poor guy, and he just is genuinely a poor guy. He has to walk through a checkpoint, and he has to feel like people are watching him all the time, and look how hard it is for him to work and go see a doctor and do all these things. But, like, why mention that the Palestinian authorities are responsible for the the civilian infrastructure, and they just don't fund anything? Why mention that, he goes to Israel for all his medical care because nobody there funds anything, and there's garbage all over the place because the Palestinian Authority fails as a governing body, but of course it's Israel's fault. Or why mention that the wall that separates these two people is not built on ethnic lines, but on practical needs, like based on practical needs after buses were blowing up in Israel for a year and a half, right? You don't need to mention any of these things because the facts get in the way of the narrative, right? And I think we need to step away a second from the facts. We know that the facts are on our side, and we need to be better at building narratives. We need to be much better at building narratives, and we don't. You say the IDF still does it today. It's crazy. It drives me crazy.
Right. Absolutely. And I think also more specifically to our question about Netanyahu, because it's the narrative also of that we talked about earlier, about how the innocent Gazan who's only suffering and the IDF is as gung-ho. It does give you that feeling then who's the head of the IDF is Netanyahu. And of course then you have these more recent debates that, for instance, just this week there was an attempted kidnapping in Gaza by Hamas, right? They're still active, and yet we've been months saying that Hamas aren't a strategic threat. They're not a threat anymore. Why aren't we having a ceasefire? But clearly they are a threat. Clearly they are willing and wanting to carry on harming Israelis. And if it was now it's soldiers who are in Gaza, but if there are no soldiers in Gaza, then they would logically go to the next step. It's that really that harming that narrative of we're the occupying force, we are the ones who have all the power, and therefore we're the ones controlling the suffering. So it does give it quite a lot of perspective. do you feel like you are in the war there protecting your people? Do you think that you could be sustainable carrying on fighting for Israel as you've been doing?
Yeah, I think we need to separate things out for a second, because there's the mission. I'll keep it brief, but there's the mission that you do as an individual, and the IDF always does the mission well, and does it ethically and morally well. Like we approach missions and we do them well, and then there's the tactics and there's strategy, right? So tactically, Israel and the IDF always very good. From a strategy perspective, I think almost every single person in Israel wants a better strategy, wants to feel that they know what the strategy is, wants to feel that the IDF knows what the strategy is. It's not a secret also. The IDF goes and says it out loud. Hey, this is a bad idea, Like, conquering all of Gaza, gonna be very hard. Like, we can do it, but then what? Like, we need a strategy for how we approach this afterwards, right? So in that sense, I think that Netanyahu failed on October 7th, chose a losing strategy prior to October 7th, never took responsibility for any of it, never said sorry to the Israeli people. I think it's very hard for a lot of people with that fact, and with the fact that probably he's also going to be reelected, because Israelis are very bad at holding their political leadership accountable for anything. All that being said, there's a mission and there's a land that needs to be defended, and we'll do it. It needs to get done, so we're going to do it, and we'll figure that out. Like, that's what I say. We got to figure out problems internally, and it's none of anybody's goddamn business. How we handle our leadership, and we will handle them, and it'll get done, right? Yeah. And nobody try to fuss in the meanwhile, because you're going to find out that they're, don't try and think that this is an opening for you, because nobody's going to sit on their thumbs and die, Yeah. We're the most powerful army in the Middle East, not for no reason,
Yeah.
So
and it's not we're not fighting for Netanyahu, we're fighting for families, and that's what people sometimes forget. I'd love to then move on for the last question. For us young Jews around the world, we are, especially after the 7th of October, there's been such an awakening and a reconnection both to their Judaism and also to Israel, right, from people that you would never imagine. And in the Jewish Stand, we're always forward-facing. We like to always see, even in the difficult times, a future ahead of us. And this is where I guess I'd love to hear what you think, and the audience would as well. What do you feel the future holds for young Jews, I guess also in Israel, but also around the world, in the UK, in the US, where you're from? What would you like to see, and what do you think we can be doing?
I think for me, I'm 31. It's easy to be a Jew in Israel. Easy to be a Jew in Israel. I think the biggest challenge is for the Jews of the diaspora, and I think Israel is a little bit malicious. I wouldn't say in the sense that there's this claim that, Israel is increasing anti-Semitism abroad. No, anti-Semites are increasing anti-Semitism abroad, right? The existence of the state of Israel as a sore point for anti-Semites, good. It should be a sore point for anti-Semites, and we'll deal with the consequences of that. And all it does is light up the anti-Semites so that you know who they are. That's good, perfect. But it does put every single individual Jew in a difficult spot where now they can't put their head in the sand. They can't just pretend, oh, everything's fine, everybody loves me, I'm a regular citizen in my country, and nobody's going to question my loyalty, nobody's going to think that I don't belong here. And it forces them to reaffirm, first of all, that in every country that Jews have been in, that they are assets to that country. They have never not been an asset to any of the countries they've been in. They're always leading scientists. They're always leaders in society. They always want to contribute to the societies that they're in. There's no interest in controlling anything. There's no interest in deciding how people live their lives, right? It's been true for every society. And it's also been true that in every society that Jews have been in, when things go bad, the Jews are the first to go because of this exact reason, because they do so well for themselves. So I don't envy the position of Jews in the diaspora, but I think they can play a pivotal role in, one, how Jews are viewed abroad all over, and how Israel is viewed. And I think Israel needs to do a lot more to support those Jews, not overtly. It doesn't help anybody when you have foreign interference in other people's countries, but supporting them emotionally, supporting them in their growth as leaders, supporting them in the discussions that they can have, right? Like, Qatar pours hundreds of millions of dollars of funding into lots and lots of youth movements in America, and I don't know, in the UK maybe. because they understand that even if I don't tell them, hey, say the words I want to say, that I support these perspectives gives them power and lends them strength. I don't have to tell them what to say. I just have to find the people who are already saying it and support them. And I think Israel would do well to support Jews in the diaspora. If you're a Jew in the diaspora and you're thinking about your future, I don't think Israel is the place for everybody. It's a hard place to live. There's a lot of work you have to do. And I think the best thing that you can do to put a thumb in the eye of any anti-Semite is succeed and, be strong and make strong communities and be leaders in your communities and be in the places of power that will allow you to fight these anti-Semites where it matters, and not, on Facebook and social media where they're yelling into the void and we're giving them that space and that voice. And I think as a general rule that Jews are doing well. I think it's always important to take a positive outlook, and that we're the best time in human history to ever be alive. You have literally the most opportunities any human has ever had to do whatever it is you want to do. And you also have a country that will defend your right to do it, and defend your right to be Jewish internationally, and feel safe to be a Jew and be proud to be a Jew. And I think that's what I would hope that a lot of young Jewish people feel. I know it's a more complicated reality than that, but
no, it's an amazing message, because I know a lot of when I was in university, a lot of students would come up to me and tell me that they would feel bad. That they're in university and their peers are fighting, getting wounded, getting killed sometimes, all the way over in Israel, or even not even just disrupting their family. And how do you really balance that? And I think you give such an excellent message that I think we in the Jewish Stand really try to push, is that we need future builders. We need people, not only in Israel, we do need that, obviously. We need young people to be taking up the reins and looking to the future, see how we can build a better future, but also around the world. We Jewish communities around the world are still here. There's thousands of communities all over the place. And we need young people to be proud of being Jewish, but also to know that they need to succeed. They need to be where they are right now. If that means go to university, then finish that degree, and doing the war in your own way, to help the Jewish people survive.
Yeah, the key argument a lot of times for the existence of the state of Israel is its necessity, right? Like, Israel has to exist as a state because there's anti-Semitism all over the world, and where else are we going to feel safe? But I run a nonprofit, right? Nonprofits are an indication of a failure of the government to do a thing, right? If a nonprofit exists, it means that there's a need in society that's not being met by the government. Because otherwise, if they were meeting the need, I wouldn't need to exist. In the same way, the existence of the state of Israel is an indication of a failure across the world to make Jews feel safe. Right? And so if you're a young person today growing up in the UK or America, your goal shouldn't be to move to Israel. Your goal should be that you don't ever have to move to Israel, right? Like, that's what I would hope young people are striving for, right? To make Israel obsolete. You want to go there because the Kotel's there and it's a beautiful place and there's gets hummus and everybody's really nice and friendly and there's peace and love, and right, but not because you don't feel safe in your country. And so I would really hope that not just that people are striving to be leaders in their societies, so that one day Israel doesn't need to exist as a state, and make Israel obsolete. Make Israel obsolete, and that way Jews can feel safe wherever they want to live, and that's what I would really hope. That's the message that I would ask most Jews to think about. So, yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing, Menachem. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation to have you. I wish you all the best in your PhD, and I hope it starts soon. I hope that the Iranians deal with whatever issues they have with your chemistry building and everything works out well. I wish you safety and hope your family's okay. Thank you so much for your time. Make sure everyone to check out our Spotify, our Instagram, our LinkedIn. These are on obviously the website, thejewishstand.com, if you haven't yet already. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify to see more of these really insightful and important conversations. Menachem, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Bye-bye.